Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our latest Disability Rights New Jersey webinar. The title of this webinar is Special Education, Extended School Year Services, and Compensatory Education. Before we start, we'll begin with the disclaimer we used last time as well, that the contents of this webinar are for educational purposes only, and nothing in the contents should be considered legal advice. First, we're going to talk about the basic principles of extended school year services, compensatory education, and graduation under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's important to discuss the basics of those issues first to make more sense of how COVID-19 has impacted those issues. Then we will discuss some strategies as to how to deal with those issues in light of the pandemic. As we already explained in the previous webinar, which was held earlier this week on July 7th, little side note, if you would like the recording for that, please visit the YouTube channel for ATAC NJ, ATAC NJ, and the recording lives up there. We are also recording this webinar, and we will share the link with you later today or over the weekend. And I will make sure to put the link for earlier this week's webinar in that email as well. All right, now that I got that out of the way, we're aware that some people may think that the issues discussed in the webinar are short term, but as we're all starting to realize pretty quickly, it doesn't look like the pandemic is going away anytime soon. You're probably already aware of the toll remote learning took on our students' abilities to grow. So recapturing that lost time with students, teachers, and therapists is going to be a long journey. Also, it's likely we'll see more waves and spikes of new cases. So even if schools reopen in the fall, there's always a chance they're going to close again during the year. Remember that many who have COVID-19 don't exhibit any outward symptoms at all and can still infect others. So we've already seen restaurants, bars, and other business establishments reopen only to close again when patrons tested positive. The reality is we don't know how long the pandemic will last, if it will spike again, or the long-term effects of remote learning, and we need to be prepared. So just a few housekeeping things. Like I mentioned before, the webinar is being recorded. It will end up on the Disability Rights New Jersey website at some point, but I know in the immediate future, the recording will end up on our YouTube channel that I just mentioned. If you just take a minute and make sure that you're muted and that your video is off. I can actually see all your videos are off, so thank you. We will take questions at the end. So please feel free to type information into the chat box at any time during the webinar. Our speakers will be reviewing that, and we'll have some time at the end to answer some questions. We have two presenters today, and they are the same presenters from our previous webinar. They're Robert A. Robinson and Regina Ann Smith. Mr. Robinson, who is deaf himself, has been a special education attorney with Disability Rights New Jersey since 2002. He has represented clients in special education at just about every level: mediation, due process, in the Office of Administrative Law, and in federal court. Ms. Smith is a third-year law student at Creighton University and currently a summer extern with Disability Rights New Jersey. But she's not our typical extern. She's a special education teacher, having taught students with disabilities in the Collingswood School District. She also created the transition program for students aged 18 to 21 in that district. So let's talk a little bit about IDEA. As I'm sure all of you already know, the IDEA requires the provision of a free, appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, for students between the ages of 3 through 21. The U.S. Department of Education announced at the end of this past April that school districts are still obligated to provide FAPE during the pandemic. The Department of Education basically said that the technological advances we have allow for the creative possibility that FAPE can be provided during this national emergency. Generally speaking, students classified under the IDEA receive educational services between September and June, just like non-disabled students. If non-classified or classified students fail a course, they may end up in summer school, but hopefully no one has to do that. But some classified students could qualify for educational services during the summer months, even if they did well in their courses during the school year. If they need educational services during the summer, then it is because the IEP team determined they need consistency and routine so they won't lose the progress they gained during the regular school year. By losing progress, I don't mean the typical mental rustiness at the start of the school year after enjoying the summer. I mean significant loss or regression to the point where the student cannot regain the progress made during the regular school year that was just completed. The provision of educational services during the summer or other time periods school is not typically in session is called extended school year, or ESY. Not every classified student is automatically eligible for ESY. ESY services are specialized instruction or related services that are part of a child's IEP. What ESY looks like for your child is based on the student's individual needs. It could mean one-on-one tutoring, a few sessions of occupational therapy or speech therapy each week. They could be provided at school, at the child's home, or some other agreed upon location. If your child receives ESY services, they are at no cost to you because they're required as part of FAPE. So remember, FAPE stands for Free Appropriate Public Education. A high percentage of students who receive ESY services tend to fall within the autism spectrum, but the determination as to who qualifies for ESY is based on the need to prevent significant regression. The IDEA makes it clear that the district cannot limit ESY to students with certain issues, disabilities, or classifications. For example, the district cannot refuse to give ESY to any student with ADHD or a learning disability. It also cannot limit services only to students who fall within the autism spectrum. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, districts have had to change the way they provide instruction because of social distancing requirements, as you've already noticed, I'm sure. This would apply to ESY services too. Any IEP that currently includes ESY services should be implemented to the greatest extent possible during the pandemic. So when and how is ESY determined? It's usually determined at the annual IEP review meeting at the end of the school year. Unfortunately, convening an IEP meeting can be quite difficult during the pandemic. Districts might claim they made a sincere effort to set up an IEP meeting when they have not. For example, they claim they left voicemails to the parent but haven't heard back. That's why you should document your efforts to make the meeting possible by sending written correspondence like emails and follow-up letters. Because of social distancing requirements, it's most likely you'll have your IEP meeting by way of teleconferencing or video conferencing. The district has to make sure you are able to fully participate in the meeting. If having the IEP meeting in a particular way won't work for you, then the district has to find another way to make it possible for you to fully participate. At any rate, during the annual IEP review meeting, the district might initiate discussion about ESY. If the district doesn't, and you believe your child needs ESY, then you should, of course, bring it up. To determine the child's needs for ESY, the IEP team must do a regression and recoupment analysis. The two primary questions the IEP team needs to consider are, 1, would your child lose important skills if he or she doesn't receive continued instruction? And 2, Would it take a long time to regain those skills, longer than those without a disability? If the answer is yes to both of these questions, the child would need ESY. If your child has a history of regressing and struggling to relearn, the IEP team should take that into account. If there's no data, it can be harder to know or prove whether a student will regress without ESY. But there are some questions the team can go over to help predict how likely the student is to regress. These include, but are not limited to, the following. Has your child had difficulty retaining skills over shorter breaks? Does your child need continual reinforcement to keep his or her skills during the regular school year? Does your child have behavior issues that get in the way of learning during the school year? Will that be a problem next year without continued support over the summer? Is your child making steady progress toward meeting IEP goals? And will a break in service threaten that progress? Is your child just beginning to master a critical skill like learning to read? The greater the number of yes answers to those questions, the greater the likelihood the child will receive ESY. If you and your school district agree that your child needs ESY and the type of services to be provided during ESY, that would make your life a whole lot easier. Why? Because remember, the annual IEP review meeting tends to take place at the end of the school year, right before summer starts. If you get into a dispute over ESY, or if you believe your child needs ESY, but you haven't had an annual IEP review meeting yet because of the district's stalling tactics, you would need to go to the Office of Administrative Law, which hears special education cases, but there wouldn't be much time to resolve the issue with summer right around the corner. Given the short time frame for resolving ESY issues, I don't see how filing just a regular due process petition would work, because the Office of Administrative Law can take a long time to decide cases. The case would be moot if the summer is over and the administrative law judge hasn't had a chance to rule on the issue. The only realistic way to obtain ESY services is to file for emergent relief to get before an administrative law judge quickly to prove your case for ESY. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because you would need an expert witness to vouch for your child's needs for ESY. Expert witnesses with proper credentials who would be willing to testify in court are not so easy to find and may charge a lot of money. Many parents tend to provide just notes and letters from medical professionals vouching for ESY, but they don't have much, if any, weight. Your expert witness would need to provide testimony and counter the district's expert witness's opinion that your child does not need ESY. Expert witnesses need to be present either in person, by telephone, or video conferencing, so the judge can listen and observe them. That's how the judges determine which expert witness is more credible. This is significant because judges issue decisions on the child's need for ESY based on the credibility of experts. But what I said before, the best scenario is an agreement between you and the district over the need for ESY, so you won't have to go through the hassle of making your case in a short time. Unfortunately, disagreements with districts do happen, and they happen quite often. The COVID-19 pandemic has had an impact on ESY services. As is the case during the second half of this past regular school year, ESY instruction would not be provided in the same way as it was before the pandemic forced school closures, given the social distancing requirements. Some districts have shortened their in-person ESY program and are beginning later this summer. Other school districts have decided to keep ESY virtual by the computer. School districts may offer summer learning opportunities for all students to address learning loss resulting from the transition to remote instruction, but that's more connected with compensatory education, which Regina will go over soon. Any IEP that currently includes ESY services should be implemented to the greatest extent possible during the pandemic. How the ESY services should be provided should really depend on the child's individual needs. For example, providing certain services remotely, like physical therapy or speech therapy, might work for some students, but might not work for others. Some students need hands-on instruction or services. Some students have problems focusing and need redirection, which would be hard to do if instruction is provided remotely. In a weird, twisted way, it's a blessing for the purposes of ESY that the pandemic hit a few months ago, because by this time, the IEP team should already have a better idea as to which type of instruction or service would work better for the child. All right, I'll let Regina, who will be discussing compensatory education, take over.
Good afternoon, everyone. As we move into our next topic, please feel free to continue to use the chat function to ask questions. I see we have some good ones already about ESY or compensatory services. So compensatory services are not to be confused with ESY. Remember, ESY is for students who are getting a free, appropriate public education, but need to continue services while school is closed in order to maintain progress. Compensatory services, on the other hand, are for students who didn't get the free and appropriate public education, and they need services in order to catch up. Compensatory services make up or compensate for services lost. The aim or goal of compensatory services is to place the student in the same position he or she would have been in if services were appropriately provided in the first place. A student might need compensatory services in just one area of their IEP, or sometimes more than one. Wherever the student did not receive services required by their IEP, or those lack of services or the way that the services were provided didn't help them meet their goals. This can happen when those services aren't provided in a timely manner at all, or the services received were inappropriate or not enough for the student. So compensatory services can be made up at a later date. They can be made up during the regular school day and hours, or even outside the normal school schedule. They can be provided over the summer, and that's one reason why it's really easy to confuse ESY and compensatory services. The way that the services are delivered or made up depends on the student's individual needs. Compensatory services traditionally is awarded when there's a huge denial of faith. The documentation and evidence needed to prove a denial of a FAPE is extensive. It can be really difficult to argue for compensatory services. Districts may disagree with the parents about the need for compensatory services. And if this happens, you need to file for due process and argue in front of an administrative law judge. And it can be hard to prove that need. But today, we're going to talk about compensatory services in terms of COVID. So we'll call it COVID catch-up. You see, no one knows the long-term effects of school closures this past spring. So today, we will look at different ways that the school districts might provide services to catch students up. Some districts are planning to offer students summer services. Some are creating a whole plan for all students, regardless of classification. Some have put additional supports in place for the new year to make sure students do not fall behind. Others are working to determine which individual student will need those services, who did well during the school building closures, and they'll do that on a case-by-case basis. And still, many schools have yet to make a decision. You see, when the pandemic hit, the U.S. Department of Education issued guidance on March 12th, outlining what the school districts could do to provide a free, appropriate public education during this emergency. Very importantly, the memo states that if a student did not receive special education services during the school closure, The IEP team must make an individual determination whether and to what extent compensatory services may be needed. For example, a student who requires physical therapy as a related service 2 times per week might not have gotten some or all of those services because of COVID. So they might be granted an additional physical therapy session that would begin once closure or quarantine related to the virus was lifted. If a student received telehealth services in other related service areas, but it was ineffective, this student might also qualify for compensatory education. Some might be given the opportunity to extend the school day to work on IEP-specific goals in academic areas like English or math. If a student had an ineffective or a reduction in transition programming, the school might decide to work with community partners to make a determination on how students can receive additional services. This process will be difficult for both parents and the school districts because there are no clear legal answers. We've never come across this before. So we want you to be prepared, as prepared as possible, to have the conversation with the IEP team about creating a program that will assist your child in making up for services lost. The term compensatory education, as it's been used in the past, doesn't completely relate to the pandemic because it sends a message that the district did something wrong or is at fault because it failed to do what it was supposed to do. The COVID pandemic and the school closing isn't the parents' fault. It's not the district's fault either. The fault really doesn't matter. If a student did not receive mandated services within the IEP, then that student is eligible to get makeup services or compensatory education. You can all appreciate your child's teachers and therapists and what they did to navigate the virtual shift, while still being mindful that virtual instruction is not the same as classroom instruction, and it might not have been as effective. So some questions you'll want to answer look very similar to those ESY questions. Did the student regress during the closure from previously attained skill levels targeted in his or her goals? Has the child failed to progress enough to realize meaningful progress toward his or her annual goals by the conclusion of the year for which the IEP was originally written? Did the student during a break become so disengaged from the learning process that he or she requires additional programming or supports to re-engage? And also, was there a period of time that your child went without services at all while the district was shifting to remote instruction? Answering yes to any of these questions is a good place to start the conversation with the district about compensatory service. Not every child, however, will need such services. The answers to these questions will depend on part in a child's capacity to learn virtually during this closure period and on the level and quality of virtual programming that was offered by each school district. So the more robust, the greater the services under the school district's plan, hopefully the less will be required to compensate for the effects of the closure. The most important thing you can do right now is prepare for that conversation. So in order to do that, you're going to need a record of any skills your child seems to be losing or interventions you used to prevent a loss of skills. That Department of Education March 12th guidance recommends that school districts schedule IEP meetings to discuss compensatory services once school reopens. Convening teams to address this issue before reopening makes a little sense because the full duration of the closure, the level, the type of programming students will eventually receive, and the effects, both on any of the individual children, are still unknown. If you don't hear from your school district, though, when it reopens, request a meeting in writing to discuss compensatory services. You should send a letter, and that letter should be sent via email or mail, depending on what your district prefers. And the school has 20 calendar days to respond and hold the meeting. So that doesn't include school holidays. At the IEP meeting, the team should determine if the student is eligible for a COVID catch-up program, extending the typical school program, or other compensatory educational service. Each district is going to handle this process differently. This is where you would bring up the effects of virtual learning and present any documentation you have collected to show that the student didn't get all of the things required in the IEP, or to show that the student might not have met their goals. This conversation will look different for every student, and it's new territory for schools to navigate. So again, the best thing you can do is be prepared. Here are some ways you can prepare. The IEP team should have helped you to establish a way to track services that were provided during remote instruction. If you didn't document or track this information, do not worry. You can go back through emails and create a log of sessions your child attended remotely. You can also contact the related service providers and teachers for their data, which should include the date and time of service and what goals were worked on. If the learning was self-directed and your child watched pre-recorded lessons, look on your email server or Google Classroom to record what your child worked on during the pandemic. So the information that you're going to want to record should be dates, what the therapist or teacher worked on with the student. Was it a live session or recorded for a student to watch on their own or with you helping them? Or did you just receive a packet of worksheets to be completed? How long did that one session last? Or how long did it take to complete the work? And what did they do? Then you're going to want to go back to the IEP that was in place during school closure. Flip to those goals and objectives section and think about the work that was completed during the school closure. Were any of those objectives met? I'd say use the 3 bears approach. Was the work too hard? Was it too easy? Or was it just right? And did your child make any steps to accomplishing the goals in the IEP? So what you're going to want to do is you go through the goals and objectives and you cross out the goals that were met. Then you want to put a question mark next to the goals that you are unsure about. Maybe you didn't notice if there was any instruction on that goal. Finally, you want to highlight the goals that minimal or no progress was made. Bring your highlighted IEP with you to the meeting. It will be a great visual to show progress or lack thereof. The next step is to think about behavior, social skills, self-help skills, and physical needs. You see, even if these weren't addressed in the IEP when schools closed, because the general curriculum was enough for that student to continue to show growth in those areas, the school closure might have changed that. Did you notice a change? Were there tough days? Anxiety and mood changes are very real in all people during this time of social distancing. Some classified students will need these areas to be specifically addressed, and that might not be possible with the general education curriculum. You keep logs, notebooks, a fill-in form, Excel document, some way to track all of this. If you saw a decline in certain skills, write it down. Did your child receive related services virtually at the same frequency they were prior to the pandemic? Were there social skills and soft skills goals that went unaddressed because of the nature of virtual learning? Taking the answers to those questions with you to the conversation about compensatory services can really help to lead that conversation with your IEP team. Recognizing this is not an easy task for families, while you have many other obligations and responsibilities. Video recordings on your phone might be another great way to keep track and have evidence that there were goals that were left unmet and regression in areas where they used to have those skills. And then finally, you're going to want to go back to maybe some of the online programs that were used during remote instruction. Most of those online resources have some sort of system of tracking. And so you should just be able to press print on the online resources, or reach out to teachers or related service providers for their information on tracking if needed. Keeping track of this progress or lack of progress made toward the goals is very important for the purposes of seeking necessary and appropriate compensatory education once school reopens. Not every student will need compensatory services or a COVID catch-up. Compensatory education is determined on a case-by-case basis, and the determination will not be made until the students return to school. Each case is fact-specific, and compensatory services award are directly related to the student's loss of their opportunity to receive an appropriate special education program and the services the school district should have provided in the first place. Switching gears a little bit to compensatory services with our students who have already accepted their diploma or aged out. They might still qualify for compensatory education. Graduation does not take away the right to file for compensatory education. And if a student moves from one district to another, even during this pandemic, the right to seek compensatory education from the old school for the failure to provide an appropriate public education during the pandemic does not go away. If you have a meeting or an IEP meeting and you cannot reach an agreement with the district to seek these COVID catch-up compensatory services, you can file for mediation or file for due process. You file these with the New Jersey Department of Education, and you can do this up to 2 years from the date of the old district's or previous district's failure to provide the free appropriate public education. Mediation is a voluntary process, and it brings people together with a third party, a mediator. They help the two people communicate with each other and hopefully resolve disagreements. Because it's voluntary, the school and the parents have to agree to mediation. The nice part is discussions are confidential. So that means what's said in mediation cannot be used as evidence if you do have to move to a due process hearing or even filing a civil lawsuit. The outcome of mediation is either a signed, legally enforceable written agreement, or no agreement could be reached. Some of the things you might want to prepare yourself for if you're getting ready for mediation is to make a list of your child's needs and questions you want to ask. Think through what the district might ask and write down possible responses. Organize your documents, put dates on them, and bring extra copies. So all of that reporting, all of those tips on how to prepare for the conversation, you can bring all of that with you. Bring those materials and use them to explain and inform others. In mediation, you're going to want to be willing to listen, even though it can be difficult, and carefully consider creative ideas, possible solutions, and work together to solve the problem. You also want to kind of work through your emotions before you get to the meeting so that you know how you have a plan to deal with the things that are kind of tough or difficult. If mediation is not successful, or you didn't agree to mediation and you want to file for due process, that can be used to resolve disagreements as well. In that case, though, a hearing officer or administrative law judge makes the decision for you. If the decision is appealed, then a judge would make the decision. For due process, considerable preparation is needed to present a case adequately, and parents should be prepared to gather and submit evidence. That's all that documentation and record keeping we talked about earlier. You'll want to prepare testimony, witness lists, and other hearing documents as was described during the ESY portion. You'll have to be ready to question and cross-examine witnesses and choose if you're going to hire an attorney or not. Your parental rights in special education or prize handbook will have more instructions if you need to file for mediation or due process for compensatory services. So at this time, we've talked about extended school year. We've talked through extended school year with the pandemic, what compensatory services usually are used for, how they might be used in terms of a COVID catch-up, and the process that you're going to go about to have this conversation with your district. So at this time, we welcome any questions that you have. I see we have a few in the chat that Robert, our attorney, is going to answer for you. Thank you.
I would like to add one thing about due process. Right now, everything is being done by Zoom or via telephone. The administrative office of the law always makes announcements. So please look at the OAL website, and then you can find the most current information about how they're handling cases. Right now, there are no in-person hearings going on, only telephone conferences and Zoom conferences. Hopefully, we would hopefully we would have good internet access for that, but you never know. So do we have any questions? Do we have anything that we need to address?
We do. One of the questions in the chat says, would a lack of academic growth throughout a school year indicate a need for or benefit of for getting ESY services, especially if there's no clear data demonstrating regression in previous summers?
I'm sorry, I missed the question. The question I answered was typed, and I responded by typing the answer to that person. Did I respond with a good enough answer for you? Is that a satisfactory answer for you? The line between compensatory services and ESY can be very blurry. Okay, and there was a question about compensatory services, if they would include an internship opportunities, or would that be lost due to the coronavirus for students who have already graduated or already 3 or 4 months in preparation? That seems to be related to, it sounds like it's related to transitional services, that question about the internship. I would suggest that you meet with the school district and see how internship opportunities could be made up. Discuss with them how internship opportunities could be made up. And transitional services, same with academic instruction, they can't be provided the same way now during the pandemic because of safety concerns. So that situation is going to have to be resolved in some other kind of way, and maybe with an internship. For example, Regina is an internship, well, extern, she's called an extern, and she started last month working at our offices. I actually have I've never actually met her in person. So it just, everybody in every situation has to be flexible, has to adapt. An internship in the virtual world is going to be completely different. We don't know exactly sure what that's going to look like. And if you have a kid who has done nothing whatsoever with an intern during the coronavirus, it's very possible that they would need some kind of compensatory services. Was there another question? I'm seeing my son got 2.5 hours per week of services during school year. Can that be extended to 3 hours during ESY? Can that be made up on compensatory services? It can be, but it's going to be very, very difficult to show the amount of compensatory services. They tend to have two different kinds of approaches to figuring out compensatory services. One way is hour by hour. For example, I suppose a student is supposed to get 6 hours a week of services and they only got 3. That would mean that the student is entitled to have 3 hours additional compensatory services. But the other kind of approach to figuring out services, and I certainly don't like this approach, is to make the whole approach, if the student didn't get services throughout the year from the IEP, but they still met that IEP goal or objective, then it's just kind of brushed away, it's pushed under the carpet, and that's not a valid approach, not an appropriate approach. So my answer is that it depends. I know everyone hates to hear the answer, it depends, but it really does. It depends on the approach that is used by your school district. Apparently, Regina is disconnected because of bad storm, bad weather. So if anybody has any other questions for Regina regarding, she can provide a compensatory service answer later on. I'm not sure if I understand that question. What is a teacher called video?
Okay, that's me. What if you call student on the phone, do video conferencing, send out Google? So basically, you made the assignments, but you can't physically visit the child because of the pandemic. And with the parent's blessing, the student does not do the work. The teacher is responsible for providing it and responsible for getting the child to do it, but the child doesn't do it and you can't physically get there. So what's the legal ramifications?
Wow, that's a very difficult problem because parents, especially during the coronavirus, this is really requiring parents to do their part, to really step up. For example, my son is 6 years old and he's not able to go to school now. So I'm having to work and also to teach him. And I got a list of lesson plans from the school district, from his teacher. And so I have to pick up some of the slack on that as a parent. So yes, in this situation, the parents are really going to have to pick up as much slack as they possibly can. That, of course, presents problems because the coronavirus is a situation where a lot of parents don't even speak English. Mm-hmm. And they're in they're just not equipped to provide education to their students with special ed needs or not. And so some parents are able to help out, just at least make sure the child does their homework. And some parents really just aren't. And that's kind of the way it is for right now.
Well, how about if the child's capable? Like one case, I had a child who admitted to me on the phone he's out playing Minecraft and Roblox, and he did the work during the third quarter, but during the fourth quarter, he didn't touch the stuff at all. And I tried call, video conference, and nothing was being produced.
That's why this virtual education, virtual instruction is really not going to, it's just period, just not going to be successful for some students. some students just require a more hands-on approach than we can provide with video virtual instruction. So we have to redirect them, find some kind of way to have this work. A lot of students are dealing with issues of ADHD, for example, or behavioral issues, and those are going to be those issues are going to be just compounded with their situation at home. A home that's filled with distractions. And I have to admit, I personally have ADHD myself. It's hard. It has been hard for me to work from home during this pandemic. So that's why every lunchtime I go out running, because it sort of focuses me. So I've had to find some kind of way. Obviously, I didn't go out running at lunchtime before when I went to work. So I've had to find another way to approach it. So for students who have those kinds of disabilities, ADHD and autism, things that make it hard for them to focus, what I recommend is that you discuss this with the school district and whoever is providing the virtual instruction and say, this just isn't working. Can we discuss this? But understand you've got a good argument for compensatory education. As Regina had just explained, it's hard to figure that out though, because it can be a very inexact science how to figure out the exact amount of compensatory education. Do we have any other comments or questions? If I have not appropriately or adequately responded to your question, please feel free to email me. Mike, can you go back to the slide that shows the email addresses? advocates@drnj.org is our email address. And this webinar, again, will be posted on the website so that you don't have to worry about trying to write it down as quickly as you can. You can check it out later. It will be posted on the website. And the last webinar that we did just a few days ago has already been posted on our website, on YouTube, and I believe also on DRNJ website. Okay, so are there any other questions or anything? I think it looks like we're ready to wrap it up, because I believe Zoom is going to kick us out soon. And I think we have some weather issues, so I think we'll wrap this up.
Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. As I mentioned before, we did record the session. We will follow up either later today or over the weekend with an email that will give you the link to the recording so you can review it afterwards. Thanks again. Take care.
Can I add one thing? On the website, it said there's a very small link for COVID ID. COVID, if you press the COVID link, that will give you more information about COVID specifically related to special education. Have a good day, everybody, and then enjoy your weekend. Please be safe and be careful in this weather. Have a good day.